Good afternoon, African Confessions. I am back with another episode. There is a message that I want to share with you guys, and the message reads like this. Hello, how are you, Brother Nashi? Can you please post my story? I am a lady who is aged 32. I was raised by my grandmother and my grandfather. The reason why we had to stay with our grandparents, it was because our parents died when I was very young. So my grandmother, after the death of my parents, she took us in. It was me and my two sisters. Me and my two sisters, we grew up in the village. But my grandfather was working at a certain farm, but he was the foreman at that farm that he was working at. A lot of people respected my grandfather. He was like the best man to that white guy that he was working for. Anything that my grandfather wanted to be done on that farm, the owner of that farm will end up doing whatever my grandfather wanted him to do. There were many times over the weekend when we would see that white farmer coming to the village with his kids so that they can just visit my grandparents. I don't know what my grandparents had done to those white people, because whenever they would come and visit us, they would leave my parents with some game meat just for free. So my grandparents, what they used to do is that each and every year, my grandmother and my grandfather, they will take us to this certain sangoma for a cleansing ceremony. And this happened for many years until the death of my grandfather. The way that my grandfather died, it was quite a funny death, because he died whilst he was at work. On that farm, there was this certain tractor which was only used by my grandfather. If my grandfather was on his leave, even that white farmer will say that this tractor is not supposed to be used until he has come back from his leave. My grandfather died whilst he was just sitting on that tractor, but he was on his lunch break. We were told that when he had taken his lunch break, he was parked next to a river, but people do not understand how the tractor started on its own, then it drove straight into the river. That is how my grandfather died. When my grandfather died, when his body came from the mortuary, whilst they were preparing his body, even though my grandfather had been washed at the mortuary, but they removed him from the coffin. They did this whilst he was in his bedroom. What I saw is that some of my grandfather's relatives, they went to my grandfather. They went into my grandfather's bedroom and they were holding a lot of charms and herbs. I had one of my uncle telling me that they placed all of those charms and the herbs into his coffin so that he can be buried with them. My grandfather was someone who was well known for using a lot of strong charms. My grandfather's relatives were afraid that if they do not bury my grandfather without all of his strong charms, maybe those charms will start sacrificing all the people in the family, because I heard my uncle saying that we don't want anything that is going to demand blood from us. On my grandfather's funeral, there was a lot of debates that were going on, because as a family, we were called into another room after the burial of my grandfather. That is when I started to hear what had happened to my parents on the day that they had died. My parents were involved in an accident. It was an head-on collision with a bus. Then my parents perished on that accident. That is how we came to stay with my grandparents. But before my grandfather's funeral, we had never heard that story. But my grandfather's relatives started telling me everything that had happened to my father, and they told me that my grandparents were the ones that had sacrificed my mother, and my father was unfortunate enough that on the day that my mother was supposed to be sacrificed, he was also in the car with my mother. That is why his life was also taken. So my grandparents, relatives, they were saying that they didn't want anything to do with all the evil charms that were left behind by my grandfather. We all know that when someone is about to be buried, at least all the relatives and the close people have to do a body viewing. But what surprised a lot of people on my grandfather's funeral, the body viewing was done inside my grandfather's bedroom, and we were told that they had taken out his corpse from the coffin and they had placed it on the bed. Only a few people were allowed to go into the bedroom and to look at my grandfather's corpse. After my grandfather's funeral, no one spoke about the things that they had seen on my grandfather's corpse, but we all know that there is nothing that travels so fast like gossip in the village. One day, when I had gone to the river to fetch water, one of my best friends stopped me. She was also coming from the river. Then she told me everything that she had heard her father telling her mother. On that day, that is when I heard that the few people who were allowed to go into my grandfather's bedroom, what they saw there was quite shocking. That friend of mine had heard her father telling her mother that my grandfather's corpse had turned into a snake. My grandfather had not turned into a complete snake, but it was his skin that looked more like a snake. That is why my grandfather's relatives did not allow anyone to do body viewing when my grandfather was about to be buried. When this whole incident happened, I was dating this boyfriend of mine back in the village, and he also dumped me because of this incident. His family had advised him not to date me anymore, so I stayed single for a little while. After finishing my school, I then moved to the city. When I moved in the city, I started working as a maid. That is when I met a man who wanted to marry me. That is the only guy that I have dated who has attempted to marry me, but unfortunately, he just passed away, and he was also involved in an accident. That is how he died. After I had fallen in love with my boyfriend when I had moved to the city, I informed my grandmother back in the village that I had found a man who wanted to marry me, because my grandmother was someone who had raised me well. So I wanted her to know all the steps that I was taking. I didn't want to rush into marriage. I wanted her advice. But when I told my grandmother that here in the city there was someone who wanted to marry me, was it okay if I could go with this man to my uncle's so that they can get to know each other? My grandma sounded so angry on the phone, because she said that you don't even have 2 months whilst you are staying in the city, yet you are telling me that you want to get married so soon. How can you get married before I can even enjoy your money? Isn't it the reason why I took care of you when your parents died? It was because I wanted you to look after me when you are all grown up and working. Now that you are all grown up and working, you have decided to enjoy your money with your newfound love. Well, I want to see where this relationship of yours is going to go. This surprised me, but I was young at that time and I was in love. I didn't understand all these things of someone cursing you and everything. I didn't understand that the spiritual world is real. Even though growing up, there were a lot of things that my grandfather and grandmother made us to do that involved a lot of rituals, but I just thought that it was tradition. I kept on dating my boyfriend, and I went with my boyfriend to my uncle's so that I can introduce my boyfriend to the family. After we had returned back from the village, that is when my boyfriend forced me to sleep with him. I was in love with him, so at that time I didn't refuse. After a couple of months, I then realized that I had fallen pregnant for him. So I stopped working because the pregnancy that I was carrying was making me sick all the times. My boyfriend then told me that I should move in with him. I didn't hide anything from my grandmother. I told my grandmother that I was going to be staying with my boyfriend, even though we had not yet managed to raise enough money so that he can come to the village and pay for my bride price. My grandmother was really angry, and she told me that I am not going to stay in that marriage because the reason why she had allowed me to go to the city and look for a job, it was because she wanted me to help her by taking care of my siblings. So each and every month when I had arrived in the city, I saw that all the money that I was getting from the people that I was working for. So her demands were a lot, such that at the end of the day, after sending her money and groceries, I'll be left with nothing. I was always struggling. And at that time, when I told my grandmother that I was now staying with my boyfriend, I was a married woman, so it might take a long time before I could send her any groceries or money, because me and my new husband, we were in the process of saving up money so that we can travel back to the village and he can pay for my bride price. But my grandmother then placed a curse on me, and she said, I want to see if you are going to stay there with your new husband. If you stay with him for more than 2 months, and I will remove you from that house by force. So I thought that grandma was just angry and disappointed at me because she thought that I was going to be the one who was going to look after her. But everything that she had said turned out to be true. Strange things started to happen to me. I started eating like a mad person. At first, I thought that since I was pregnant, that was the reason why I was eating like this. Even my husband noticed that the way that I was eating, it was more like I was no longer a normal person. On the day that I also agreed that everything that was happening to me, it was just spiritual. On that day, I bought the first loaf and I finished it off. I went back and I bought 2 more loaves, and by midday, I had finished off those 2 loaves, and by the end of that day, I had finished 4 loaves by myself. Then I started to wet the bed like urinating when I am fast asleep. That is when my husband reached his breaking point. He could not support me because sometimes we will be sleeping. Then I would wake up and he would be angry at me, insulting me. And when I would wake up, then I would find out that the blankets would be wet because I would have urinated on them. This thing is still happening to me, Brother Nashi. I feel so embarrassed because whenever I fall in love with a guy, the very first night that I visit my new boyfriend, or if he comes over to my place so that we can spend the night together, what happens is that in my dreams, I'll see my grandmother. I'll be walking with her. Sometimes she will be walking with me to the toilet. When we are in the toilet, she will tell me to urinate. But when I wake up, I will see that I would have urinated on the bed. Most of the guys that I have been dating, they dump me because of this. They tell me that they cannot be with someone who has a problem like mine. This is the challenge that I am facing in my life. I can't even get in a serious relationship with anyone. The moment that I try to date anyone, this thing starts to happen. But when I am single, I can even go for more than 2 months without wetting my bed. I have tried to take a lot of herbs and I have visited a lot of traditional healers. Most of these traditional healers that I visit, they have been telling me the same story over and over again. They say that my grandfather, when he was still alive, he dedicated me to one of his powerful charms. So by the time that my grandfather died, that charm, he had left it in the mountains. He didn't have the chance to go and fetch his charm because of the way that he had suddenly died. So without an owner, that charm then transformed and it became a spiritual husband. And when it came into our family, out of all the daughters that are in our family, it then chose me to become its wife. And these things started to happen after my grandfather had died. So all of these traditional healers are telling me that this spiritual husband that claims that I am its wife, it is a jealous spirit. That is why when I am single, it doesn't even come to bother me. But the moment that I fall in love, then it will start to be jealous. It will come down from the mountains and it will spiritually attack me and the men that I'll be dating at that time. If that man is running a business, you will find out that he is no longer getting customers like he used to do before he had met me. This spiritual husband, it brings all of this bad luck to all the men that would want to marry me so that they can run away from me. That spiritual husband is the same one that caused the accident that suddenly took the life of my boyfriend. I am still looking for a solution to my problems. I have been going around and I have been visiting a lot of traditional healers. Sometimes it gets better. Then when I start dating, it gets worse. Dear listeners, right there was a message that I received from Anonymous. Then I asked our admins to give us a translation. Please let us talk about this issue in the comment section. I'll be back with another episode.